listener production.
Hi, I'm Sasha Barbagat. Welcome to The Briefing. Australians are having fewer babies. It's not a new trend. We've been seeing a decline in the birth rate over the last decade before hitting a record low in 2020. A birth rate of 2.1 is needed to sustain a country's population. Right now, it's sitting at 1.63, and experts don't think it'll ever lift much higher than that.
If we wanted to stay the same size as we are, we would need to continue our international migration intake. In about 15 years, if we didn't have an international migration intake, we would actually shrink.
So, if we can't sustain our population, will that spell trouble for Australia's future? One expert doesn't necessarily think so. My chat with her coming up in the second half of the episode. But first, Antoinette Lattouf is here with the headlines. It is Wednesday, the 8th of May.
Thanks, Sasha. G'day, everyone. So we start with that awful story out of Mexico where two Australian brothers were murdered in a suspected robbery gone wrong. Callum and Jake Robinson and their American friend were shot dead while holidaying in Baja and their bodies found dumped down a well. Their parents, Martin and Deborah Robinson, travelled to the country to identify their bodies and have spoken this morning for the first time.
Our hearts are broken and the world has become a darker place for us. We also mourn the loss of Carter Road, a close friend. They were young men enjoying their passion of surfing together.
Oh gosh, utterly heartbreaking. Plans are now underway to bring Jake and Callum back to Australia to be buried.
Israel says its forces have taken control of the Palestinian side of the Rafah border crossing as hopes for an imminent ceasefire stall, with Hamas accepting a deal and Israel not. The IDF moved in hours after Hamas officials announced they had agreed to a deal to pause fighting and exchange hostages and prisoners. But Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu claims the agreement falls short of a number of their demands. It's not clear what those demands are because diplomatic sources say the agreement approved by Hamas is similar to the Egyptian proposal already agreed to.
An agreement between the government of Israel and the leadership of Hamas is essential to stop the unbearable suffering of Palestinians in Gaza and of the hostages and their families.
That was the UN chief Antonio Guterres there.
The Rafah invasion means aid isn't getting through right now. Another border crossing is also closed. The UN Secretary-General warned that Gaza may run out of fuel as quickly as tonight. Talks are resuming in Cairo, but a Hamas official says these will be the last chance to free hostages still being held in Gaza, and that the Rafah invasion has undermined move towards a ceasefire. So more than 1 million displaced Palestinians are sheltering there with nowhere else to go. The UN and Western powers have warned that a major ground offensive would have devastating humanitarian consequences, even more dire than the current humanitarian crisis. And I think that what's interesting to point out here, Sasha, is that Joe Biden has said that an invasion of Rafah is a red line. So this is a bit of a moment of truth for Biden's policy on Israel. To be fair, the Biden administration avoids that phrase at all cost, red line. We know that the US is Israel's ally, so usually they use very tempered language or language that uses a lot of words and doesn't necessarily mean anything. But there is this general consensus that this is going to thrust the relationship between the US and Israel under the spotlight and put it under quite a bit of tension. So all eyes will be on Joe Biden to see how serious he was about that red line and what he does next. Interest rates will remain on hold, staying at 4.35%. We won't see any change for another 6 weeks until the board of the Reserve Bank's next meeting. That's in mid-June. RBA Governor Michelle Bullock said in a presser yesterday that the board is determined to return inflation to its target, but that it will be a slow process.
Conditions are restrictive. We know that interest rates impact different sectors of the economy and different households differently. And what we are really trying to do is slow things enough to bring inflation down without tipping the economy into recession.
Yeah, the interesting thing out of this, Antoinette, I think, is that there's now stronger language, I think, coming from the RBA that interest rates could go up again. And that is because inflation is still too high and unemployment is still too low. So she says that it's not out of the question raising rates again. And keep in mind, we'd been hoping that by, I think, about mid this year, we were going to start seeing the cash rate drop.
Exactly.
And continue into next year. And now that's looking pretty unlikely. TikTok has filed a lawsuit aimed at legislation that had banned the app in America. The law, which was signed in by President Joe Biden last month after years of debate, would see the popular video sharing app barred from app stores from January next year, unless the Chinese owners sold it to another company. In the lawsuit filing, lawyers for TikTok say the law is an extraordinary intrusion on free speech rights. And an update on Mona's Ladies' Lounge in Tasmania. The dispute is officially going to Tasmania's Supreme Court. Mona will appeal the anti-discrimination decision that ordered the museum to allow men entry to its women's-only lounge, which is an art installation. The Ladies' Lounge has now closed to the public after the museum was given 28 days to cease refusing entry to men. That expired on Monday.
Yeah, and the plot thickens because the installation's creator has plans for the space should their appeal fail. And she's flagged they could turn it into a women's toilet or a church because under current discrimination laws, religious institutions can exclude genders if it is required by the doctrines of the religion of that institution. So I just love that she hasn't stopped fighting. She has a sense of humour about it all. And she's like, I would rather turn this into a toilet than allow men into this space.
I read she did an interview with Mona, really worth having a read if you want to have a little giggle because she really does poke fun at all the laws around discrimination. And she also talks about the fact that they would open the church to men on a Sunday, but during that time what they would do is choreographed movements to fold laundry and do ironing, which I thought that'd be beautiful to witness. I'd love to see that. And we did do an episode on this back on April 10. If you want to hear a full breakdown of this whole saga, it's absolutely an interesting chat, worth having a listen if you haven't already. Antoinette, thanks so much for joining us for the headlines today. Next up, it is our deep dive into Australia's declining birth rate and why that might not be so scary. There are a lot of reasons that might factor into a person's decision to not have a baby. Money's a big one, so is career. Climate change has been rating pretty high on lists lately as well. In Australia, we've seen a continuing decline in the birth rate after hitting a peak of 3.5 in the early 1960s, save for a few spikes in the 70s and late 2000s. And experts are predicting our birth rate will hover at around 1.6 for the next 50 years. So what does that mean for our country's future, and are we seeing similar trends around the world? Joining me now to talk about it is Professor Amanda Davies from the School of Social Sciences at the University of Western Australia. Professor, thanks for joining us on the briefing. First off, could you explain to us what the total fertility rate is? So that's the idea of how many births are needed in order to sustain a population. What does it mean and how does it work?
So when we're looking at how do we sustain a population, how do we replace ourselves, we have a look at the number of children being born per female of sort of childbearing age. And so generally that's taken to being about 15 to 45, so the number of women in the population at that time and the number of children being born. And it's a ratio. When we sort of break that down across the developed countries, so we take into account patterns around child mortality as well, so how many kids need to be in a population to make it through to adulthood. At the moment, for the sort of the health situation that we currently have, it's around 2.1. So 2.1 children per female in the population.
Mm-hmm. How is Australia tracking at the moment when it comes to its birth rate? What are we seeing and what have the trends been, the last 10 years and what are we thinking for the next 10 years?
So our fertility rate in Australia is below replacement level, so it's around about 1.6. Some areas, some states, for example, are a little bit higher than that, and regional areas tend to be a little bit higher than that still. Over the last decade, it's declined. That pattern of decline hasn't changed from about the 1960s, and the reason for it declining relates to increases in educational attainment by women, as well as the availability of contraception. It's a very, very similar trend to other developed countries. So we're certainly not alone, and it's sort of quite well understood as a declining trend. And I think many people, if they have a look around in society, would see that maybe their parents came from a family of 4 or 5, they might come from a family of 3, and they might be thinking about not having children or maybe having 1 or 2 children. So we can see that trend in our society right now. For the next decade or two, we're looking at the fertility rate declining even further. And that really relates at the moment in Australia to pressures around the economic circumstances for people who are of that childbearing age, and some of the concerns around cost of living and intergenerational debt transfer.
My question then is, if there's this idea that we have the 2.1 needed to keep sustaining our population, and we're not there right now, and we're not predicted to get there as far as 50 years away apparently, and whether it even happens then is unlikely, is that not just a really bad thing that we are not sustaining our population?
There's a number of different thoughts about this. So there's certainly a Big Australia team Big Australia, and that's really about needing to have population growth to sustain the economic growth that we have. Then we also have Team Small Australia. So that's really about trying to ensure that our current population size and future population size fits with our land carrying capacity. So the environmental circumstances and the environmental conditions of our country and what we can sustain as we go forward. So there's 2 quite different camps of thought there, but there's a lot in between, which is really about, well, how do we sustain what we've got now, and what's the right rate of growth? And that's a sort of a different question. So certainly in Australia, there's been a lot of contestation in the last decade about the rapid population growth that we've seen, and that doesn't relate so much to fertility rate and relates a lot more to international migration and the ability of the country to sustain that fast, rapid rate of growth. If we wanted to stay the same size as we are, we would need to continue our international migration intake. In about 15 years, if we didn't have an international migration intake, we would actually shrink. That might also be something that people are looking to achieve. So it's really about informing that public debate around what do we want to be as a nation.
And I think that question's been coming up a lot lately to do with our housing crisis that we're seeing right across the country, especially in our major capitals, Melbourne and Sydney, where there are concerns that immigration is having an impact on the number of dwellings that are available, that are affordable to rent or to buy. And I think conversations like this that you're having about the fertility rate kind of play into that a lot. How much would we rely on migration then to sustain our population if our birth rate doesn't recover?
So we're substantively reliant on international migration, and we have been for quite a long time. International migration has been critical to sustaining and growing the population, as well as that economic development piece. What we're actually seeing now is the debate emerging. It's mixed in with the housing crisis and the affordable living crisis. And we're looking at what's been a long-term trend in the decrease in fertility rate, but intermixing with that very significant pressure on the current Generation Z and the bottom of the millennials that are looking at having families, and asking the question, are these people being provided with the same opportunity as previous generations to have families? So it's quite a sociological question around that fertility rate. So yes, some of the fertility rates and decrease has certainly been the result of contraception and advancements in society. Now we're looking at the question of, well, is it actually, the society and the economic circumstances such that people are not having that opportunity to have children where they otherwise would want to have children? The housing crisis and the cost of living crisis is intersecting with the challenges around managing Australia's population growth. The other aspect that's facing this current generation that are looking at having children is that they will also be in the workforce when the age dependency ratio substantively increases as the baby boomer population moves through. So there's 3 different things, if you like, that are all coming in together on that younger population who are seeking to think about having children now and how they will resolve that question.
I want to ask about countries that are bucking this trend. You said Australia is not alone when it comes to a declining birth rate. Where are we seeing births hold steady or even increasing?
We're generally seeing declining birth rates across the world. We do have little blips every now and again. So in a global sense, what we will see is parts of the world, so sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa and the Middle East, substantively expanding their populations and have very large working age populations, whilst more advanced developed countries, think of the Europes, Oceania, Australia, America, they're going to have very significant ageing populations and also declining populations, if not for international migration.
So what does that mean then? It sounds to me almost like a flip of where all the young people who can work and who can contribute really effectively to society are going to be in the developing world, while in the developed world we're going to have more older people who need more support. What does that do to the quote-unquote world order? Does it change things?
At the moment, it's anyone's guess. Certainly, we still have international migration playing out. So countries like Australia and America is very, very similar, where our migration settings are around intake of skilled migrants. So that comes as a bit of another sociological question about how do these sort of wealthier countries and the impact of these wealthier countries in taking very skilled migrants from countries that might need those skills to improve their development. So there will be some shift of population around as a result of international migration based on our current understandings about how countries are going to address that. For example, as Australia's population ages, what we're likely to do with that sort of increased burden on the workforce is to look for ways of ensuring that people that are in the workforce can work more effectively. And we've seen that over time, over the last sort of 300 years, the transition in the workforce away from heavy reliance on labour and just getting smart with what we do. The advent of AI is very significant in how that's going to change the workforce and already is. And in terms of caring for older populations, we only need to look to Japan and the success that they're having in being able to incorporate some of these high technologies into the aged care service and provision and enabling that population to move through its demographic change into an older society.
Well, Professor, it's a fascinating conversation and I appreciate you sharing your insights with us on the briefing today.
Oh, thank you.
That was Professor Amanda Davies from the University of Western Australia there. Thanks for listening to today's briefing. That is all for this episode. Before you go, though, we would love it if you could share this ep with someone you think might enjoy it. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and on YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. I'm Sasha Barbagat. See you next time.
Listener.